Here. All right, and welcome to week 13. This week we're going to be covering chapters 17 and 18, which are politics and the economy. So I will look for questions. If you have any questions, just type them right here into the question box, and I'll keep an eye out for those. Okay. So, chapters 17 and 18. Chapter 17 covers government and the politics. Chapter 18 cover work and the economy. In chapter 17, we're going to be looking at power and authority, what each of those is. We'll be looking at different types of government, political behavior in the United States. There are several models, theoretical models we use to examine the power structure in the U.S., talking about the difference between war and peace and what each of them means. Look at how the internet has restructured and changed political activism. And finally, take a look at campaign financing when we look at social policy, government, and politics. Some of the questions we're going to be trying to answer: are young people more interested in their portable media players than in political issues? Part of the reason that question comes up is that as you look at higher age cohorts, political participation goes up to the point where you get to the elderly in this society. People over 50 tend to participate between 75 and 80%. How does the U.S. government maintain its power? And how do political parties and public interest groups attempt to exert their power? Finally, does our campaign finance system put some groups at a disadvantage? This becomes a very relevant question when we think about the Citizens United decision in 2010, and then the later decision, McCutcheon et al., which allows billionaires the same rights that Citizens United provided to corporations. Okay, so when we talk about politics, politics is the social institution that distributes power and authority within a society. It's the institution responsible for setting goals, implementing policy, and then achieving those set goals. Every society has some form of politics or another. There's an individual or group who makes important decisions about how to use resources and allocate goods. So it exists in some form or another in every society. Lasswell came up with this definition of politics, which is kind of an easy one to remember. It's about who gets what, when, and how. So it's about distribution. Who makes decisions on distribution of resources and goods? This definition of power comes straight out of Max Weber's work. Power is the ability to exercise one's will over others. Another way of thinking about power, power is the ability to get done what you want done despite any obstacles placed in your path by others. If you have power in a society, you can accomplish your goals in that society. Within political systems, there are different sources of power. There's three different types of power, in fact. There's force. This is the clenched fist. This is actual or threatened use of coercion, physical coercion, to impose one's will on political dissidents. Influence is the exercise of power through a process of persuasion, being able to convince others that the decisions and policies you would like implemented are beneficial to them as well. So this is through oration, through persuasion, essentially just trying to convince people. And influence can be a way of, or source of power as well. And finally, you have authority. And authority is legitimate power. Authority is power that the people in a society recognize as legitimate. So it's institutionalized power, recognized as legitimate by the people over whom it is exercised. So if we think about that, police officers, when police officers turn on lights and sirens behind you, they are exerting authority. They are exerting the power provided to them by the state to regulate traffic. And so when you violate traffic laws, they have the authority to pull you over. Most of the time, police don't have to use force or influence to get people to pull over. All they have to do is rely on their authority, and this will be enough for people to pull over and wait for the officer to tell them what they've done wrong. So, in the same way that there are three different types of power, Max Weber, continuing his work on power and authority, also outlined three different types of authority. The first one is traditional authority. And this is authority conferred by custom and accepted practice. This is the type of authority you find in a monarchy. Why is Prince Charles the next in line? Because by custom and accepted practice, the eldest child of the current monarch in England is the next monarch. And then it would go to William, and then to William's son George, because this is the way that power has been traditionally passed on, is through family arrangements. Regardless of which monarchy you're talking about, monarchies tend to rely on traditional authority. The type of authority we have in our society, in our culture, in our political system is rational legal authority. It's power made legitimate by law. When they convened the Constitutional Congress in 1787, they wrote down in the Constitution how authority was going to be distributed in our society. They divided it between the three branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial. And they came up with rules as to how power would be authority would be transferred between individuals. In the case of ours, it is for the legislative and the executive done on the basis of election. For the case of the judicial, there it is appointed by the executive but ratified by the legislative. Anytime President Obama would like to appoint a Supreme Court justice, the Senate, Congress, usually it's the Senate, but Congress itself has to approve that decision. And finally, we have charismatic authority. And this is legitimate power that relies on an individual's force of personality or emotional appeal. Examples of charismatic leaders would be Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mao Zedong, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro. And when I say that it's charismatic authority, it is the idea that they did not have either traditional authority or rational legal authority, but through their own exceptional personality and kind of oration, managed to get a lot of people to follow them. Now, the interesting thing about charismatic authority is that because it's authority centered in an individual, it will have to be transformed either into rational legal authority or traditional authority, or it will evaporate when the individual who possesses that charismatic authority passes on. When Fidel Castro became very, very ill, his brother Raul said, well, I'm next in line because I'm his brother. So there he's trying to take that charismatic authority of Fidel Castro and transfer it into traditional authority. He's saying that as the closest living family member, I'm next in line to rule, and that's the basis of traditional authority. When the former Soviet Union, who had been kind of ruled by personalities, it was Lenin who led the communist revolution, and Stalin, who was the first kind of leader of the United Soviet Socialist Republic. And it was through the force of his personality. And then following him, you had Brezhnev and Khrushchev and a number of rulers who kind of continued on having that charismatic authority. Eventually, though, they established what's referred to as the Politburo, and this is when it became a power of position rather than person. Rational legal authority. And when I say it's a power of position rather than person, when we think of like the office of president, regardless of who holds that office, whether it be a Republican, a Democrat, whether it be Barack Obama, George W. Bush, or even going all the way back to George Washington, the power that they exercise is a power of office. It's contained in the office of president. It's not a power centered in the person. So, okay, I've mentioned this type of government already, monarchy. It's a form of government where you're headed by a single member of a royal family, and the rules for succession will be clearly stated. Traditionally, if we go back in time, monarchies for the most part have passed on the power through a practice called primogeniture, which primogeniture means firstborn, but contained within the idea of primogeniture in a patriarchal society is that it's the firstborn male. And only in rare cases where you do not have male offspring would it pass to a female. In the case of Elizabeth and Victoria and Elizabeth II. Recently, England has rewritten its succession so that the eldest child of the current monarch will become the next ruler. This won't have any effect on the next three rulers because Prince Charles was the eldest of Elizabeth. Prince William was the eldest of Charles, and George is the firstborn of William. So even though they've rewritten the laws for the next three monarchs of England, we are going to have a male succession. But had George or had William and Kate had a daughter instead of a son, that daughter would be fourth in line from the crown. And so it's a form of government headed by a single member of a royal family, and the rules of succession are clearly laid out. It differs from an oligarchy. You can see it has the same archy at the end, and that's the rule. But monarchy, mono is one. Oligarchy, oli means multiple, but not in the case of poly, which can be any number. It's really a few. Really, you're talking about fewer than 10 ruling an oligarchy. Example of that would have been the former Soviet Socialist, the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, would have been kind of an oligarchy because there were a few key people, and I'm talking after Khrushchev. In the Politburo, there would be a few people running the Politburo, and they held all the power in the country. So prior to its kind of dissolution and downfall, the former Soviet Union was an oligarchy as a type of government. Now, I know a lot of people think that they were communist or they were socialist, but when we get to the next chapter, you'll see those are actually forms of economic arrangement, not forms of political arrangement. We've got monarchy, we've got oligarchy, we've got democracy, dictatorship, and totalitarianism. Well, there's also authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is a form of government in which common people are denied. The difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism is that in totalitarianism you also have central control. Authoritarianism, any member of the government, regardless of how remote from the central office, can exercise control and authority. So dictatorship, this is what we would have had under Mao Zedong, under Joseph Stalin, under Fidel Castro. One person has near total power to make and enforce laws. So dictatorship you often find in totalitarian governments, because totalitarianism is when people are subject to complete control by the government, and you may have surveillance, people watching, and there is no political participation. It differs from authoritarianism is that you can have an authoritarian society that's not a totalitarian society. Authoritarian just means people are denied political participation. And then we have democracy, and there are two different types of democracy. There's true democracy and there's representative democracy. What we have here in the United States of America is representative democracy. Democracy is government by the people, which is literally what that word means. Democracy itself. And what you have in the characteristic of democracy is participation by all citizens of society. We have representative democracy and true democracy. We are a representative democracy. If we were a true democracy, what that would mean is every single time a bill comes to the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate, before it becomes law, it would have to be put to a referendum vote by where everybody would have a chance to vote yes or no on that particular law. Because true democracy means that every single citizen participates in every government decision. So what we have is not that. It's representative democracy. Every 2 to 6 years, we elect the officials that are in charge of our government, the idea being that they go there to represent our interests and pass laws that benefit us, and make policy decisions that benefit us. And if we don't like the decisions they've made, next election cycle, we vote them out. So we're a representative democracy. There are criticisms of how representative our democracy is, especially given Citizens United and McCutcheon et al. As Supreme Court decisions, which what the Supreme Court really ruled on with those decisions is equating money with free speech. So essentially the way that they ruled it is because corporations are legal citizens and because private citizens, in the case of McCutcheon et al., basically just built upon Citizens United. But the whole idea behind Citizens United was corporations are legal citizens. They have, therefore, the right of protected speech. But the way that corporations speak is by spending money. So money is their political speech. And that's kind of how that decision was handed down. When we think about participation, in the last election, the 2014, what are called midterm elections, because there was not a presidential election, less than 36% of our population, of the voting population, actually got out and voted. So this is why it says only a small minority of citizens participate in political organizations on local or national level. Voting is a type of participation in a political organization. However, they're also talking about being a recognized member of the Republican National Convention, the Democratic National Convention, or participating in political organizations on local level as well. 2000 was only 62% of eligible voters. That was actually an increase over 2004, where you had roughly 58% of the voters turn out. And it drops off in off-election years. The whole idea, of course, is that participating politically, if everybody participated politically, politicians would have to think more about the interests of the people and less about special interests. But when there's limited political participation, some politicians interpret that to mean the people who aren't voting are happy with their lives. Researchers give different reasons when they talk about political apathy. A lot of it has to do with not really seeing your interests represented. If we think about the makeup of Congress, yes, we have an African American in the White House. But when we look at Congress, Congress is over roughly 90% white male. So minority groups, women and racial and ethnic minorities, look at Washington and they do not see themselves represented in the Senate and the House. This leads to lowered rates of participation. So when we say political strength is lacking in marginalized groups, we're talking about groups that have a minority status. Progress towards inclusion of minority groups in government has been slow. We can see this in a lot of the rhetoric following the 2012 election from political conservative pundits talking about this isn't your father's country anymore. Some people have interpreted that to mean that they were essentially saying this is a country in which groups that were traditionally marginalized are getting greater participation. But if we think about it, with 90% of Senate and Congress white male, that's not really an inclusive picture. First of all, if it was representative on the gender basis, it would be over 50% female, because women are over 50% of the population of the United States of America. It would be roughly 16% Hispanic, roughly 13% African American, and roughly 6% Asian American. And then other groups smaller there. But this is not what we see in the makeup of Congress. Female politicians may enjoy more electoral success, but the media, according to research evidence, covers them differently. They focus on things with female politicians that they might not with male politicians. When Sarah Palin ran as John McCain's vice presidential candidate in 2008, I distinctly remember a lot of the focus in media, not necessarily on whether or not she's a good politician, but the fact that she had won beauty contests younger in life. That's something that you wouldn't really hear pundits talking about with reference to a male politician. And that's just one example of how female politicians can be covered differently than male politicians. Okay, we're beginning to take a look at theoretical models that can be used to analyze politics as an institution. The first one is the idea of the power elite model. This was developed by C. Wright Mills, the same sociologist who gave us the sociological imagination. And what he had here was, in his power elite model, society is ruled by small groups of individuals who share a common set of political and economic interests. For Mills, that was military, industrial, and political leaders. And Mills specifically put those three groups in his elite model, in his power elite model. There's also the Marxist power elite model, which we'll get to in just a second. Mills said power rests in the hands of a few. In fact, Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his farewell address, when he warned of the danger of the military-industrial complex, was referencing the idea that Mills had in his power elite model. It says not a conspiracy, it's just that when you have military, industrial, and political leaders coming together, there's a community of interest and sentiment amongst those people. There's a reason that every single state does some level of defense contracting. Defense contractors have ensured that the military budget remains as it is by ensuring that each of the 50 states produces for defense contractors. And so, according to Mills' model, this is one way in which the industrial leaders, the defense contractors or the industrial leaders, have ensured that their interests are always going to be interests that are protected. We also have Domhoff's model here. And Domhoff's model is additionally a power elite model. William G. Domhoff. This is also a power elite model that Domhoff was taking a look at here. He was not as restrictive on the types of leaders. He said that there could be various different leaders. He didn't say it had to be restricted to the military industrial. And so if we look at page 379 of your textbook, this has kind of the two differences here. We see Wright Mills had a pyramidal structure where the corporate rich political and military leaders, so you had the industrial, political, and military leaders at the top. For Mills, or for Domhoff, it was a little different, and he created a Venn diagram. A Venn diagram is when you have overlapping circles showing influence. And so we have the social upper class, the corporate community, and policy planning network. And where you see the overlap of those three circles is where his power elite exists. So there's the corporate conservative. When Domhoff looks in the electoral arena, there's the corporate conservative and the liberal labor. Because in general, liberals have tended to ally themselves with labor unions and things like that, while corporations have tended to ally themselves with the political conservatives. So this is kind of how Domhoff's model plays out. Now, both of those are conflict perspective, where there's an elite that protects their own interests and has control, and the rest of society is kind of exploited to protect those interests. Moving to the pluralist model, this is more of a functionalist approach here. And what this says is there are so many competing special interests within the community that have access to government, no single group can become dominant. And because we have all these different lobbyists acting on behalf of these different special interest groups, we get decision-making being distributed through a whole bunch of different special interest groups or elite groups. And so the variety of groups plays a significant role in decision-making. One of the criticisms of the pluralist model is that it does not address power within the operation of deciding what gets debated on. So essentially what this is saying is that, well, yes, you may have a multiplicity of groups all trying to get their interests heard by the government, but at the top you have groups that make decisions on what the government hears, groups that have greater access. And so it fails to address this potential power of the elites to keep matters like welfare, increasing welfare services. There may be a lobbying group in Washington that's lobbying on behalf of that, saying we need to increase the number of social safety nets our society provides for low-income people. But the criticism of the pluralist model says that, yes, that's a group that has a special interest, but because that group is a group that doesn't have as much power as the military group, the group of military defense contractors, the defense contractors will ensure that none of their budget ever gets diverted into providing those safety nets by keeping it from being debated. And so you notice there's not an interactionist perspective on politics. And that's because politics as a social institution kind of operates across the entirety of society, so we need those macro-level theoretical approaches to understand how politics operates. We can do an interactionist perspective. We can do research on the basis of people looking into whether or not their vote means anything, but that's more individuals' attitude towards government. When we look at the operation of government, we need those larger level macro approaches. So we've got Domhoff and Mills elite models. There's also one that's not covered in this textbook called the Marxist political economy model, which is essentially just saying that politics operates to benefit the interests of capitalists, of corporate leaders. And then the functionalist perspective. So we've got more conflict perspectives than functionalist perspectives. The functionalist perspective is the pluralist approach. Okay, moving on to these ideas of war and peace now. Of course, Leo Tolstoy wrote his book War and Peace, looking at the differences in these conditions and how they act in society. So war, conflict between organizations such as governments, although private entities are beginning to, if we think about like Blackwater, private entities are beginning to be able to field massive armies as well. But it's conflict between organizations that possess trained combat forces equipped with deadly weapons. We go back 200 years, the only organizations that could field standing armies for combat would have been nations. Now, with some of the multinational conglomerates controlling as much, if not more, capital than most of the nations of the world, these conglomerates can field their own combat forces. Now, the legal definition of war typically requires a formal declaration of hostilities. That is why Korea, technically not referred to as a war, when it comes to history books, it's referred to as the Korean conflict or the Korean police action, because Congress never formally declared war in Korea. Not in the same way they did in Vietnam and you know, when we actually went to war in World War II and World War I. The legal definition of war: the president has the authority to disperse troops, however, and he is the commander-in-chief. However, it is Congress that has the power to declare war. It is not the president that can declare war. When we think about war, global kind of what research is being done, Global View studies how and why nations become engaged in military conflict. And just to give you some idea of the standing of the U.S. as a warring nation or a peaceful nation, it's hard to make the argument that we're a peaceful nation when for all but 5 years of the 18th century, all but 5 years of the 19th century, the 19th century, the 1800s, every year in the 20th century, the 1900s, and every year in the 21st century, the U.S. has had troops deployed, engaged in combat somewhere in the world. Now, this has not always been war because we haven't always had the formal declaration of war, but there have been 5 years since the year 1800 where the United States has not had troops deployed, engaged in combat somewhere in the world. So the global view, that like big macro level view, would look at how and why nations become engaged in military conflict. The nation-state view, if we move down kind of a unit from the globe to individual nations, looks at the interaction of internal politics, socioeconomic, and cultural forces. War, unfortunately, in capitalism, war is a way of strengthening your economy. You declare war on somebody, and all of a sudden you got to produce all the stuff you need to wage war. And it's big business. And then the micro view focuses on the social impact of war on individuals and their groups. So if we think about the women, the Kurdish women who are opposing ISIS right now, and if you haven't heard about this, there are women as young as 13 who are going out and actively engaging in combat against ISIS, coming from the Kurdish region of Iraq and Turkey. So the micro view might look at what's going on there. Okay, peace. One way of defining peace is just the absence of war. A broader definition of peace is the proactive effort to develop cooperative relations among nations, thus relying on diplomatic ways of resolving conflict instead of war. And here you see one of these things on the Global Peace Index. The U.S. doesn't rank very high. New Zealand is at the top of the index, which is very peaceful. And then Somalia, Afghanistan, and Iraq would be at the bottom. Not peaceful at all. The U.S. is kind of classified medium on the Global Peace Index, 83 out of 144. International trade and the increasing globalization of the economy may deter wars as well. The largest peacekeeping initiative happened in the 20th century, and it was the establishment of the United Nations. Because the idea behind the United Nations was we will give nations a forum in which to resolve conflicts in a peaceful diplomatic fashion. And if you think about it, the term that the UN uses for their troops, the troops that wear the blue helmets, they call them UN peacekeeping troops. So right in the title of the army that the UN uses is their mission, which is peacekeeping. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, things like Amnesty International, Human Rights Council, things like this also try to promote peace. Amnesty International is one of the groups that really kind of tries to promote peaceful coexistence between culturally different groups. The interesting thing, of course, there's always a trade-off between security and freedom, peace and freedom. The interesting thing here is that you cannot maintain security through threatening violence. There are social researchers who have taken a look at a lot of the attacks that have happened on the U.S. And the fact that, you know, the increase in terrorist attacks in the U.S. kind of correlates with an increase in U.S. troops being deployed in certain regions of the world. So you can't, it's kind of axiomatic that you can't maintain security through threatening violence. Okay, terrorism, which is a type of warfare, it's a type of warfare characterized by a couple of significant features. One is there is no distinction made between military and civilian targets. And two is it is the use or threat of violence against random or symbolic targets in pursuit of political aims. Think about the targets on 9/11. It was actually 3 very symbolic targets, if we believe that the 4th plane, Flight 93, was headed towards the White House. Because we've got targeted that military-industrial political complex. Think about it. The World Trade Towers, the seat of the U.S. economy. The Pentagon, the seat of U.S. military might. And the White House, the perceived seat of the U.S. government. Because arguably the office of president has been called the most powerful office in the world. So it was 3 very symbolic targets that were actually selected as the targets. And that's the second time the World Trade Towers have been targeted by terrorists in the United States of America. The first time was actually in 1993. There was a bomb that went off in the towers in that year, but the death toll, I want to say the death toll was about less than 200 people for that one. Now, another interesting thing when we talk about terrorism, culturally in the United States of America, when we use the word terrorism, we're talking about people from outside our borders. But prior to 9/11, the single largest terrorist attack in the United States of America happened in Oklahoma City, and it was committed by an American citizen named Timothy McVeigh. And that was a symbolic target. And according to the definition of terrorism, it was a terrorist attack as well. So some of the things that terrorism also is characterized by, this idea that the end justifies the means. And then if we think about what ISIS or ISIL, however you want to talk about that, ISIS itself is Iraq and Syria Islamic State. Iraq and Greater Syria Islamic State. ISIL means something very similar, but you'll hear ISIS and ISIL used interchangeably to discuss that particular group. But if we think about the essential aspect of contemporary terrorism involving the use of media, think about the videos that ISIS has released and has wanted news media outlets in the U.S. and other nations to play. In fact, Fox News came under fire for posting the entire video of the Jordanian pilot being burned alive. And a lot of other news agencies essentially said that Fox News is doing ISIS's work for it by airing that video. That was some of the criticism leveled against Fox News for showing that video. The other thing you find is, like I said, interestingly enough, when we think about ISIS, right now there's a group of Kurdish women fighting against them, and that has to do with this idea of symbolic enactments of masculinity. The fact that terrorism involves kind of a patriarchal masculine approach in the minds of the terrorists themselves. And so these women going out and fighting against ISIS and killing members of ISIS is actually somewhat demoralizing to many members of ISIS, because women in that, in that area hold a subordinate role in society, yet they're the ones that are actually managing to accomplish some very high military objectives against ISIS. Okay, political activism on the internet. It is a force to be reckoned with in politics. That should say 73% of adult internet users in the U.S. went online to get 2010 election news. Not new. These things have editing problems in them. So when we think about this political activism on the internet, it's also a place where grassroots campaigns for political activism and for social movements can be begun. You can start a social movement on your Facebook page. There were a number of websites and a number of internet sites and Facebook pages and other social media pages devoted to things like the birther movement, which was something that kind of plagued President Obama, the idea that he was not a true American citizen. But the Democratic convention and the Republican convention both use the internet and email to reach out to contact supporters. Much of political participation, where people used to go out canvassing door to door and used to get involved with organizations in kind of a face-to-face way. Now a lot of people are just going online, and political participation is happening online. And it's not limited to our two-party system or just to domestic politics. You can find sites where you'll be asked to contribute or participate in a survey about what's going on in Nigeria or what's going on in the Middle East. So it's not just it's actually crossing political boundaries as well. If you think about the Arab Spring, which was when there was a lot of revolution going on in Middle Eastern countries, Facebook pages were very much a part of Arab Spring, when we had it happening in Egypt, and we had it happening in Libya, and we had it happening in other countries. And the web, when it says circumventing restrictive controls of authoritarian regimes, we saw this play out during the Arab Spring. Things like Amnesty International, other organizations like that. The internet is a great way of keeping these people who are not contained within a particular region in contact with each other. So borderless organizations that unite people of like mind are growing in importance. Campaign financing is the final thing we're going to look at in this chapter before we move on to the next chapter. In 2008, $5.2 billion was what was spent on all federal campaigns. 57% of our voters favor limits on campaign spending. 59%, when we think about Citizens United, 59% of the people support some kind of constitutional amendment in polls to limit the effects of Citizens United, to limit campaign contribution. However, on the opposite side of that, there are roughly 40% of our population who believe a candidate should be able to spend whatever they want to spend. It was the Federal Campaign Act of 1974 that restricted donations for national office. There were some loopholes that allow what's called soft money. Soft money is money that does not go to any one specific candidate, but goes to support a platform that many candidates may share. So, if we think about campaign finance, and right now this is a big issue with Citizens United and McCutcheon et al. Functionalists look at it as a beneficial thing. Political contributions keep the public involved in the democratic process. Obama was able to generate massive amounts of money from mostly contributions from individuals that totaled under $200. Now, when we talk about political contributions at the federal level, $200 is not much. That's a very small contribution. When you think about individuals that have the ability to write a check for $1 million or more for just one candidate. Conflict theorists, this allows, our process essentially allows donors to influence policymakers because the policymakers realize that if they want to continue to receive that level of donation, then they're going to have to listen to these interests of the individuals and do something about at least considering them. In fact, just recently, Wall Street has used that as a threat. They are not happy with a senator named Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts because she's advocating for Wall Street reform and wants more regulations put in place. She wants the Glass-Steagall Act put back in place to regulate what banks are allowed to do regarding investment. Wall Street has essentially threatened the Democratic Party with closing their coffers as far as political contributions go unless the Democratic Party reins in Elizabeth Warren. That's a very easy thing to interpret according to conflict theory. Essentially, Wall Street saying, we'll get somebody else in office because we have the money to do that unless you play ball with us. When we think about something like that, that's very easy to interpret using conflict theory, where the donors are actually trying to threaten politicians. And then from the interactionist perspective, we really just kind of focus on this idea of the symbolic significance, which contributes to voter apathy. My vote doesn't matter because all they do is cater to the corporate interests. So if that's my public perception, if that's the public perception that big money drives U.S. elections, what's the point in voting? And so when we look at this from the interactionist perspective, it's really about the meaning of Citizens United, McCutcheon et al., essentially looking at this as politicians just buying or being bought outright. And that matters when it comes to political participation. If there were less people that had that perception, politicians would be more worried about what the common person thinks and the common person is doing, because that's where the votes come from. So, how does this affect policy? Traditional reform groups continue to call for tighter limits on contributions. And we're seeing this. This is not something that's a left-right issue. This is really, you find groups on both sides of this issue, the Democrats and Republicans, that want tighter limits on contributions. However, right now, the politicians that are in favor of campaign finance reform are in the minority. So, Citizens United versus the FEC. It ended restrictions on organizational contributions. And then McCutcheon et al. Extended that same easing of restrictions to private billionaires. And this becomes important when we think about how the average cost of a campaign. Essentially, there was, and I can't remember who it was, but there was a Republican candidate who had decided he was going to explore running and has already decided not to run based upon the amount of money that Jeb Bush, as a Republican presidential candidate, has access to through the network of his father, his brother, and that he can, in a time when other people are happy if they can raise $50 or $100 million at one campaign donation event, Jeb Bush is capable of raising $500 million at a similar type of event because he has access to the big donors. Okay. So that concludes our discussion of Chapter 17, Politics and the Government. Next, we'll be looking at the economy and work. Some of the things we'll be examining: economic systems, 3 different types of economic systems. We'll take a look at capitalism in China, where you do have some limited capitalism going on, but not everywhere in China. It's actually restricted. Work and alienation, where we'll get into a little bit of Marx and Weber and their ideas on how people become alienated at work. The changing economy. Microfinancing, which is something that's been growing in popularity, which are small business loans, essentially, making small loans to people to start up small businesses. So, questions we'll be addressing: what makes work satisfying? How have trends towards deindustrialization changed the work people do? shifting from manufacturing to information, perhaps. And what will the workforce of the 20th century look like? Okay, one of the first things to discuss here is this idea of fair trade. This is a social movement. You may have seen fair trade on certain items. Fair trade coffee is a big one. In fact, there was an individual in my department at Notre Dame who pushed and pushed and pushed and started a social movement on campus about fair trade coffee. And now all the coffee sold on Notre Dame campus has to be fair trade coffee. But the idea behind this is that when you buy fair trade coffee, you're paying a substantial amount more. But you pay above market prices so that the farmers who are actually producing, say, the coffee, there's also fair trade tea, there's fair trade chocolate, because a lot of these things, the people who are out gathering the cocoa beans and the coffee beans and the tea leaves are not making enough money even to survive. So it's essentially a social movement. It's conscientious shopping to make sure that people in low-income nations are being paid a living wage. So, but what we have to do is, when we do that, we can't just say, well, you know, in Jamaica, $15 an hour is a living wage, because that's essentially looking at our standard of living and applying that to Jamaica. So we need to view the foreign workers and factory owners from the perspective of their own cultures, employing what's called cultural relativism, opposed to ethnocentrism. One of the things that, when I talk about my face-to-face class, a couple years ago, the workers at Walmart factories in China went on strike to go from 60 cents an hour, 65 cents an hour, up to $1 an hour. And a lot of students reacted negatively, saying $1 an hour, that's not fair wage. But in the Chinese economy, that $1 an hour actually puts them in the middle class. It has much more buying power in their market than it does in our market. And so we can't say automatically that paying workers $1 an hour is an unfair wage. We need to look at what's going on both in their culture. How does this $1 an hour work in their economy, and in the working conditions? Are they allowed bathroom breaks? Are they getting a lunch break? You know, if they're getting those kind of things, it might not be horrible. And so we have to incorporate their own view in there when we think about some of these issues. Okay, economic system is the social institution in which goods and services are produced, distributed, and consumed. We all participate in the economy. Anytime we're going to work, we're participating in the economy. Anytime we go shopping, we're participating in the economy. Anybody who might have been a delivery driver, you're participating in the economy. So, different types of economic systems. Karl Marx did a lot of his work looking at the shift from feudalism to capitalism as a society undergoes industrialization. And the characteristic of an industrial society is that it relies on mechanization, which can be defined as power from a source that is not animal power. Okay, so it's not a horse-drawn oxen, you know, or a horse-drawn plow plowing up the land with the farmer having to walk behind it. It's using different types of power and relies on mechanization. So capitalism, socialism, and communism are the three types of economic systems. Capitalism is what we have here in the United States of America, means of production, and when I talk about means of production, the means of production are the factories, the businesses, the corporations in which goods are produced. So the means of production, in a feudal society, the means of production are the land, and the land is held in trust by the crown for all of the people in traditional feudal society. land is operated in common for everybody by the nobility and the aristocracy. Capitalism is held largely in private hands and operated for individual profit. Now, one of the things that capitalism easily provides is the motivation to act. So it's accumulation of individual profits that can motivate me to act fairly readily. And then the other idea here, based upon the work that Adam Smith did in The Wealth of Nations, where he talked about the invisible hand regulating supply and demand. The invisible hand regulating supply and demand in a market economy only exists if you have a laissez-faire economy, in which businesses are allowed to operate and there's minimal government intervention. Laissez-faire comes from two French words, laisser, which is to let or allow, and faire, which is to do or to make. So essentially when you talk about a laissez-faire economy, you're talking about an economy that's allowed to operate on its own. Now, one of the things that we do have in the United States of America we have antitrust laws, which is what the government uses to break up monopolies. Because monopolies destroy the ability of Adam Smith's invisible hand to regulate supply and demand. Because no matter how much demand there is for a particular good, if I'm the only person producing that good, you pay what I want or you don't get that good. And if it's a good that people need, like in the case of a telephone, then the government will step in using the antitrust laws and break up a monopoly, which is what they did to the former ITT phone company when it became the various Mountain Bells, which are regional phone companies, and AT&T as the long-distance service provider. AT&T and all of the various bells, Mountain Bell, Pacific Bell, Midwest Bell, all those kind of things, used to all be one company called ITT. And ITT did not have to obey market forces because they were a monopoly. You wanted a phone, you paid whatever they wanted. So monopolies can be damaging to the invisible hand in a laissez-faire market. Okay, next we've got socialism. And socialism, the means of production and distribution are owned collectively. Now, you can have where they're kind of regulated by the government, but owned by other individuals, which would be state socialism, or you can have where the government actually owns them outright. And then as a form of socialism, there's communism. In communism, property is communally owned and no distinctions are made on the basis of people's ability to produce. What that means is that ditch diggers are paid the same as doctors. Lawyers are paid the same as laborers. And the idea behind that is that every job is necessary for a society to function, and nobody had a hand in choosing the skills they were born with. So just because somebody has an aptitude for medicine where another person doesn't have the mental acuity, but, works very hard at being a ditch digger, why should the doctor get more than the ditch digger in pay? And that's just kind of the philosophical idea behind communism, is that nobody chooses to have the skills and aptitudes they're born with, so nobody should get paid more or less on that basis. Of course, there's a further argument there. Essentially, when you look at something like ditch diggers and doctors, both are necessary for a society to function, right? Well, you might make the argument that doctors actually provide a more valuable service. That may be true. However, without the ditch diggers, doctors become overworked because it's the ditch diggers that dig ditches where you put sewer pipes that keep us from wandering around in human waste. Without ditch diggers, we have people wandering through human filth getting sick at a higher rate. So that's kind of the response to the idea that doctors provide a more valuable service. Doctors would be overworked without the ditch diggers digging sewers to keep the level of sanitation higher in our society, which reduces outbreak of disease. So, now the informal economy, of which the black market is a part. Black market tends to reference transfers of money, goods, and services not reported to the government that are also illegal. Informal economy just refers to any transfer of money, goods, or services that is not reported to the government. So if you've ever had a garage sale, did you pay taxes on it? Then it's part of the informal economy. If you've ever been, as a child, a babysitter or somebody who goes around and cuts lawns, did you pay taxes on that money that you earn? If not, it was part of the informal economy. So not necessarily illegal activities are the only activities performed in the informal economy. Legal activities are too, but not reported to the government. In the United States, it's about 8% of economic activity divided between licit and illicit activities. In developing nations, it's a much higher part. In some of them, it can top 50% of the total economic activity, and may even run higher than that in some nations. Okay. By the year 2020, the United States of America, it's estimated, will no longer be the number one economy in the world. 5 years from now, essentially, China is expected to become the largest economy in the world. So what happens? Well, there's going to be competition for things that may change a lot of the low prices we enjoy in the U.S. now. It's actually interesting that we have gasoline as cheap as it is because the demand for gasoline is actually increasing. In China and in India, which are the two largest countries in the world with regards to population, you have rapidly expanding middle classes. And one of the first things that middle class people want is their own car. So this is increasing the demand for gasoline radically. And right now, the United States, with 5% of the world's population, consumes about 26% of the oil in the world. It's going to be harder and harder for us to maintain low oil prices with more and more people acquiring personal vehicles. And especially when we look at the Chinese being more interested in acquiring the latest consumer goods. Cars, TVs, computers, smartphones, all this kind of stuff. China is an interesting case because they do have a large economy, but they've got such a large population that they still have a massive percentage of their population living, a much larger percentage of their population living a traditional subsistence level agrarian lifestyle than we have here in the U.S. Peasants are still roughly half of the Chinese population living in small villages, producing as much as they consume. In the U.S., you don't really have that anymore. So, China's economy has become open to capitalism. However, capitalism is restricted in the areas where it's allowed to operate. Hong Kong is one area where capitalism is allowed to operate in China. Shanghai, Beijing, but it is not allowed to operate just anywhere. However, the decision to open China's economy to capitalism has reduced the Communist Party's influence, and increasingly the middle class in China lives a lifestyle that is very similar to a Western lifestyle, the lifestyle you would have here in the U.S. or in England. So, in 1949, the Communist Party under Mao Zedong assumed control of China. They nationalized And when you talk about nationalizing private businesses, that's essentially the government going in, declaring eminent domain, and just taking it over. So they outlawed profit making and nationalized all the industry in China. The government assumed direct control over it. So that by the 1960s, the economy was dominated by state-controlled enterprises. Part of the problems in that is that if you have socialism where it's state-controlled, state socialism, there's no competition on prices. The market creates competition for prices. Adam Smith's invisible hand regulates supply and demand. That won't happen where the state owns the means of production of goods and services. And then it was in the 1980s that they began allowing, because of the disparity between Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the rest of the Chinese mainland. Hong Kong was still leased to the British at that point in time. Taiwan is where Chiang Kai-shek's government fled when Mao Zedong's government assumed control in China. And for a long time, until Nixon went to China in the 70s, we did not have diplomatic ties with them because the U.S. supported Chiang Kai-shek during this period. But in the 1980s, the government eased restrictions on private enterprise, and then by the mid-1990s, party officials began allowing businesses, essentially just giving businesses to private entrepreneurs, realizing that if they were operated for profit, then they operate in a fashion that's sustainable. Socialism has yet to discover how to produce goods in a sustainable fashion. That's why a lot of socialist economies collapse. People are... you have to have certain things in order for people to act altruistically, and socialism relies on people acting altruistically. So this growing free market economy did bring significant inequality to Chinese workers. Some of it, like the workers that worked for the foreign companies that went into China actually got higher wages. And so the Chinese capital is having to compete with multinational corporations means that they cannot always offer the most competitive wages. And if you look at this right here, GM's U.S. operations barely remains profitable, but GM's Chinese operations producing a lot of automobiles at a higher profit than in the U.S. And so this is why the Chinese capitalists have to compete with multinational corporations, because as these economic enclaves open up, multinational corporations search the world for lower wages, and so they outsource jobs from high-income nations into developing nations. So loosening state control led to a rise in job mobility, increased social mobility, and increased opportunity and prosperity for family-owned businesses. So when we look at this, this actually, from a functionalist perspective, was beneficial to society because it began creating opportunities and increasing the opportunities for people to participate in social mobility. However, from a conflict perspective, it really kind of led to more for those that already had some, and for the peasants living out in the rural communities, it didn't really give them anything. So there's that lag between urban and rural salaries, and also worker safety became an issue as well. People who were middle-aged urban workers began losing jobs as rural peasants migrated into the cities to partake in those higher wages. And this became problematic as well. And we haven't even talked about what's happened to the air in Beijing. The air in Beijing, there are days when the pollution and smog are so heavy that it looks like a thick, thick fog has rolled in, almost like clouds are at ground level, and it's creating some serious health consequences for people there. So that's just one social problem that has accompanied China's massive economic growth. Okay. Sociology has looked at alienation in a variety of different theoretical approaches. Durkheim had the functionalist approach, and what he talked about wasn't necessarily alienation. What he was called is anomie. It's a loss of direction in society when social institutions are no longer providing social cohesion and regulation to individuals. It does happen as you switch from mechanical to organic solidarity. Inevitably, the solidarity that exists in an industrial society, according to Durkheim, is a stronger solidarity, because if you remember back, we talked about mechanical and organic solidarity. Mechanical solidarity is a solidarity that's based on similarity. I like my neighbors because I'm like my neighbors. Organic solidarity is a solidarity based upon mutual interdependence and complementary differences. So it's not that I like my neighbors, it's that I need my neighbors. But in times when you have social and political and economic upheaval, individuals experience anomie. Durkheim was looking at this as he examined suicide rates in 19th century France. And essentially, anybody who knows anything about 19th century French history realizes that it was one long 100-year period of almost continuous political and economic upheaval. This is when Marie Antoinette famously said, if they don't have bread, let them eat cake. This is when you had the establishment of the Third Republic, of the Napoleonic empires, the reestablishment of the Bourbons in power, Louis the 14th, 15th, and 16th in that era. So what Durkheim did was he was looking at how religion, in the absence of economic and political social control, regulation, and cohesion, could religion jump in and substitute? And according to the work he did in the book Suicide, yes, it can, because he found lower rates of suicide in Catholicism than he did in Protestantism. And the important distinction there is that Protestantism is a more individualistic type of religion. So Durkheim said that when your economy is in upheaval and when your political structure is in upheaval, you will have a rise in anomie. If you think about some of the tropes that existed during the Great Depression, stockbrokers hurling themselves out the windows, this would be an example of Durkheim's anomic suicide. Now, Marx took a little bit different view. Durkheim said that if your economy and your political structure are stable, then you have social cohesion and social regulation, and people will be happy. Marx essentially said that industrialization within capitalist societies eliminated what he called meaningful work, work in which there was a sense of the worker, and life was being expressed through work. Marx says that there are no longer meaningful relationships with work in a factory setting. When all you do is insert tab A into slot B for 8 hours a day, that can't be meaningful work. Work has become so simplified and so repetitive, and the fact that the individual worker does not have a choice in how fast they work because the factory keeps pushing work at them at the same speed, this is what leads to alienation. And for Marx, it was a four-stage process. And alienation itself is similar to Durkheim's anomie. It's a condition of estrangement or disassociation from the surrounding individuals, surrounding society. So the way that Marx believed it happened was, first of all, the worker no longer has any control over the speed at which they're working. The factory line determines the speed at which workers have to work. If you think about working at McDonald's, when McDonald's is busy, all the workers have to work. They can't slow down and say, you know what, I want to take a little bit more time making this hamburger so it's perfect. you do that, the manager will start yelling at you. So in a certain sense, the work determines the pace of work. The worker no longer has any control over their pace of work. So what Marx said is the worker has become a slave to the product being produced. This is how they become alienated from the product being produced. There is no sense of work from the worker in that product. If you get a Big Mac in Valparaiso, a Big Mac in Chicago, a Big Mac in Sacramento, California, and a Big Mac in Tallahassee, Florida, all four of those Big Macs should be exactly the same. So there's no individualism that the worker provides. The second stage is, of course, if you spend 8 hours a day in servitude to the product of your work, Marx said the next stage is you become alienated from the process of work. You are not expressing yourself as a living entity at work. So you're alienated from the product of work, from the process of work, and then you become alienated from yourself, the worker, because you're spending 8 hours a day in an alienating situation. And then finally, you become alienated from all the workers around you. That's the final stage. This is what Marx believed would lead to class consciousness developing amongst the laborers and the eventual rise of the proletariat to overthrow the bourgeoisie. One of the reasons Marx fell into discredit is his predicted revolution never occurred. So workers need greater control over workplace and products of their labor, or they become alienated. Now, if you ever heard someone talk about being burned out at work, I'm afraid of you getting burned out at work. What they're saying in Marxist terms is, I'm afraid of you becoming alienated at work. So, burnout. If you hear that, think worker alienation. Now, Weber had a different belief on what caused alienation. And it has to do more with the prevalence of bureaucracies in the United States, or prevalence of bureaucracies as a component of formal organizations in industrial society. There's one particular characteristic. Weber had 6 characteristics of a bureaucracy. Specialization of task, hierarchy of authority, written rules and regulations, employment based on technical qualifications, written communication, formal written communication, and the final one was impersonality. Said that in order to achieve efficiency, we have to be dealing with an impersonal structure. According to Weber, it's this impersonality that leads to alienation amongst people. People get treated like a number by all these bureaucratic structures, and they stop feeling relevant or important in society. If you think about it, when you go to Ivy Tech Student Affairs, what's the first thing they ask you for? Your name? How are you doing? No. I need your C number before I can do anything else. This is what Weber felt led to alienation in society. So, worker satisfaction. People with greater responsibility experience more satisfaction. Greater responsibility for the finished product experience more job satisfaction. So, what are some of the factors? Higher wages, shorter work week, positive relationships with coworkers, in addition to having responsibility for what's being produced at the job. Now, George Ritzer was a sociologist, kind of a functionalist sociologist, and conflict as well, but he wrote this book called The McDonaldization of Society, and he essentially says that what the McDonald brothers did with food production has become increasingly prevalent in our society in a multiplicity of work applications. The positive impression given by many workers is misleading. Manual laborers have little job satisfaction. And increasingly, more and more work is becoming kind of factory line work. That's the claim Ritzer was making in the McDonaldization of society. Okay, looking at the changing nature of the workforce, one of the things that we're seeing is it's predicted by the year 2049 2050, 2051, somewhere in that area. Whites in the United States of America as a group will no longer outnumber minorities. Whites will be less than 50%, like 49% of the population. Now, they'll still be the largest group, but they will no longer be larger than all the minority groups put together. Hispanics, African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, together as a group will comprise over 50% of the population. And right now, women are already a larger group in U.S. society than men. It's something like 50.5% women, so only 49.5% men. And the phenomenon whereby women and minority groups are increasingly getting work in the economy is a trend that's predicted to continue, so that by 2018, you should actually see equal numbers of men and women in the economy. Right now, that's not true. But by then it should be, because 52% of new workers added from 1988 to 2018 are expected to be women. By the time you hit 2018, that's when it's expected that women will be more than 50% of the workforce in the U.S. Racial and ethnic minorities as well. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, relationships between workers are more likely to cross gender, racial, and ethnic lines. People are going to have to learn to be more tolerant in the workforce, because increasingly they're going to be part of a diverse workforce. Deindustrialization is the process whereby investment in factories and manufacturing as part of the economy tends to reduce. So it's a systematic, widespread withdrawal of investment in manufacturing. Right now, in 1940, it's estimated that as much as 40% of our economy was in manufacturing. 1950, between, after coming out of World War II, 40% of our economy. Right now, 12% of our economy is estimated to be manufacturing jobs. The big growth has been in service jobs, hospitality, retail, and information technologies jobs, computer application, things like that. But deindustrialization is also manufacturing jobs being outsourced, relocated to other countries. So it can take the form of corporate restructuring. One form of that is what's referred to as downsizing. You downsize your company when you no longer have, you're no longer producing enough goods to require the same size workforce. However, this leaves a lot of people adrift. What's happened with deindustrialization in this country is the people who were formerly in nice, secure, middle-class manufacturing jobs have been relegated from those into largely unskilled, insecure service sector jobs. Walmart has become the largest employer in the United States of America because Walmart snapped up a lot of the former workers in factories. So when it says social costs cannot be overemphasized, we're talking about people, this kind of mass, due to deindustrialization, this mass movement of people from the middle class down into the working and lower classes. Offshoring is part of deindustrialization as a process. Offshoring is the reference to transferring work outside the borders of the United States of America to other societies. Functional perspective says that it's actually beneficial, increasing economic interdependence, because part of offshoring is the increasing globalization of society. So from a functionalist perspective, it's actually beneficial. Conflict looks at it a little bit differently, because the impact on workers at home is severe. And we've discussed that, right? Taking somebody who had a job that might have been paying them $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year for manufacturing, and now that person is having to find a job where they're making a third of that, half to a third of that, $20,000 a year at Walmart. So it might be beneficial to overall society, but its impact on working class people is really harsh. So when we think about offshoring, certain types of work have been outsourced for generations. And that's not really been bad per se. Offshoring really as a practice began when the manufacturing base began transferring to foreign factories. We don't build TVs in the U.S. anymore. They're built in China. Things like that. The trend also includes jobs that require considerable training, not just manufacturing jobs. Accounting and financial analysis, you can outsource that to India now. Telemarketing has been outsourced to India. Hotel airline reservations, outsourced to India. Claims adjustment, outsourced to India. Computer programming, outsourced to India and to China. So, okay, microfinancing is this idea of providing small sums of money to people living in poverty as a way of maybe letting them start a business to the point where they can work their way out of poverty. It gives them the ability to, as you would say, bootstrap themselves up out of poverty. This was something that has been practiced in other nations prior to being brought here to the U.S. Bangladesh, which used to be East Pakistan and prior to that part of India, is a place where microloans have provided certain people the ability to work their way out of poverty. Muhammad Yunus was the person who kind of came up with this. So if you think about 91 million people in 100 countries, that's just what microfinancing has reached. Now, if some of these people have been able to develop a successful business model, they would employ 2 or 3 people, and they might employ more. So it reaches 91 million people. That's not to say that every single one of those people got a microfinance loan. It's just that it might have influenced them. Or if we assume that it reached 91 million people and they got microfinancing loans, we can multiply the number of people affected by this by 3. There are criticisms of it because they're still paying interest on these loans. So lenders are taking advantage of the poor. And there is some validity in that. I would look at the predatory lending practices going on here before I started looking at microfinancing, though. Payday loans do far more damage to the poor than microfinancing. So, Randall Collins looks at this and says, this is a good way to help poor people. Instead of just providing them with social welfare, you provide them with the means to support themselves. Feminists look at this as beneficial because in developing nations, 90% of these microfinancing loans go to women. In fact, I can think of specifically if you watch The Other Side of Immigration, which is a documentary, about a 55-minute documentary that looks at immigration from the Mexico side. One of the things that's discussed in there is a woman who actually received one of these small microloans and was able to start her own small textile company. And now she's employing 6 or 7 people in her hometown.
But critics maintain that the creation of small home-based industries reduces the demand for formal employment opportunities. I would kind of react to that and say, yes, that might be true initially, but as some of these people become successful, they will wind up hiring other people. So, there does have to be regulation. We can't just let this go, and because otherwise all we'll do is create another economic bubble like we did with the housing mortgage financing. So you have to look, does the person have a good business plan? Are they asking for the right amount of money, or are they asking for 3 times the amount of money they need? Because that reduces the chances that they're actually going to be successful. If they have too much money, it doesn't make them have good business practices. Lenders should be working with political leaders to ensure that they're kind of working together and not working at odds from each other. Okay. That concludes our lecture for today on chapters 18 and 19. I'm sorry, 17 and 18, not 18 and 19. We'll be covering 19, health and the environment, next week. So, I hope these have been beneficial for you. If you have any questions about anything discussed in this, feel free to email me. My email address is mhowell, MHOWELL1 at ivytech.edu. You can reach me there, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. Have a good week, and we'll see everybody next week.